A Polish fisherman hauling in his morning catch felt his net suddenly go heavy and rigid. Tangled in the mesh, 60 meters beneath the gray Baltic surface, was something impossible. It was the swept-back wing of a jet fighter encrusted with 2 decades of marine growth. Not just any fighter, but a MiG-25 Foxbat, the most feared Soviet interceptor of the entire Cold War. The year was 2012, and sonar scans revealed the aircraft sitting almost fully intact on the sandy seabed. The MiG-25 was not merely fast. It was the fastest combat aircraft ever placed into mass production, capable of sustained flight at Mach 2.83, nearly 3 times the speed of sound. Its 2 Tamansky R-15 turbojet engines each produced over 11 tons of thrust at full afterburner. The engines generated so much heat that the entire airframe had to be constructed from nickel-steel alloy, not aluminum. It was a machine built to outrun anything NATO could put in the air. No Western fighter could intercept it at altitude, and no contemporary missile could catch it from behind. NATO intelligence gave it the reporting name Foxbat, and for 2 decades it haunted the dreams of Western air defense planners. But this particular Foxbat had not been shot down in aerial combat over the front lines of Europe. It had not suffered a catastrophic engine flameout or a fatal structural failure at Mach speed. The truth of how a Soviet super-interceptor came to rest on the Baltic seabed was far stranger and far more human. In the late summer of 1988, a Soviet Air Force captain made a decision that would change his life. He was stationed at a fighter base in Soviet-occupied Latvia, flying routine patrols over the eastern Baltic. He was 29 years old, married, with a young daughter, and he wanted a different life. His name was Captain Alexei Morozov, and he had been planning his escape for over a year. On the morning of September 15th, Morozov filed a standard flight plan for a routine air defense patrol. His MiG-25 was fully fueled with 14,000 liters of jet fuel for a high-altitude interception profile. But the moment he cleared Soviet radar coverage, he did something the ground controllers never expected. He pushed the nose down and dropped to just 15 meters above the wavetops of the Baltic Sea, flying at over 900 kilometers per hour, low enough to disappear into the sea clutter of every radar scope. This technique, called terrain masking, was nearly suicidal at these speeds over open water. One wrong twitch of the control stick, one unexpected wave, and the aircraft would cartwheel into the sea. Morozov flew like this for 11 minutes, his heart pounding, sweat soaking through his flight suit. Swedish coastal radar operators briefly detected an unidentified contact moving impossibly fast and impossibly low. They scrambled 2 Saab Viggen interceptors from the nearest airbase. But the Foxbat had already crossed beyond their range. Then, at exactly the worst possible moment, Morozov's fuel warning lights began flashing red across his instrument panel. He had miscalculated the fuel consumption at low altitude, where the engines burned fuel 4 times faster than at cruising height. His tanks ran completely dry, 38 kilometers short of the Swedish coastline near the island of Gotland. The twin engines flamed out within 3 seconds of each other, and the cockpit fell into an eerie, sudden silence. Morozov had practiced this moment 100 times in his mind. He pulled the ejection handle and was blasted out of the cockpit by an explosive charge at over 20 Gs of force. His parachute deployed cleanly as the MiG-25 continued its ballistic trajectory toward the sea below. The 40-ton aircraft hit the water at nearly the speed of sound and disintegrated on impact. The forward fuselage, including the cockpit section, drove itself 15 meters deep into the soft sediment of the Baltic floor. Morozov drifted down into the cold September water and was rescued within 2 hours by a Swedish Coast Guard helicopter. He was granted political asylum in Sweden and eventually resettled in Canada with his family. But the his Foxbat, lay shattered and buried in the dark, cold water of the Baltic. The Baltic Sea, like the Black Sea, possesses remarkable preservation properties that defy normal marine decay. Its brackish water has unusually low salinity compared to the open ocean. Coupled with near-freezing bottom temperatures and low dissolved oxygen at depth, this creates a natural conservation environment. When Polish Navy divers, working from sonar scans, first reached the wreck in 2013, they were left speechless. The iconic Red Star insignia of the Soviet Air Force was still visible on the tail fin beneath a thin layer of silt. The canopy acrylic was spider-webbed with cracks, but the ejection seat rails inside the cockpit were still bright and shiny. The massive Tumansky engines, each the size of a small car, were largely intact despite the violence of the impact. No MiG-25 had ever been recovered from the sea in any condition remotely approaching this level of preservation. The Polish government, recognizing the immense historical significance, authorized a full-scale salvage operation within 6 months. They brought in a floating crane barge from the Gdansk shipyard with a lift capacity of 200 metric tons. Salvage divers worked in water that hovered at just 4 degrees Celsius, with visibility often less than 2 meters. They attached inflatable heavy lift bags to 8 structurally reinforced hardpoints along the airframe. Each bag had to be inflated at precisely the same rate, monitored by laser, ranging from the surface support vessel. A deviation of more than 3 degrees in the aircraft's attitude during the ascent would snap the 40-year-old nickel-steel alloy like a dry twig. The controlled lift took 9.5 hours and required constant micro-adjustments to 700 separate ballast valves. Diver teams rotated through the freezing water in 45-minute shifts, their hands numb but their focus absolute. When the Foxbat finally broke the surface, Baltic seawater cascaded from its twin-engine nozzles in 2 dark waterfalls. A crane lifted the dripping silt-covered aircraft onto a waiting transport barge with infinite mechanical patience. Within 72 hours, the Foxbat was inside a conservation hangar at the Polish Aviation Museum in Krakow. What followed was one of the most painstaking and technically demanding aircraft restorations ever undertaken in Eastern Europe. Every removable panel, every access hatch, every cockpit instrument was photographed, cataloged, and removed. Aluminum components suffering from galvanic corrosion were submerged in deionized water baths for months to draw out absorbed salts. The nickel-steel skin panels, designed to withstand skin temperatures of over 300 degrees Celsius in supersonic flight, were in remarkably good condition. But the internal aluminum alloy stringers and ribs had been slowly consumed by electrochemical reactions over the decades underwater. Each corroded structural member had to be individually reverse-engineered and fabricated from original Mikoyan-Gurevich engineering drawings. Cockpit instruments with their distinctive blue-green backlighting and Cyrillic labels were disassembled, cleaned, recalibrated, and reinstalled. The pilot's ZH-5 flight helmet, still clipped to the ejection seat headrest, still bore its original Soviet manufacturing stamp from 1986. The engines were the biggest challenge. 24 years submerged in salt-tainted water had seized every moving component. Specialists from the original Engine Design Bureau in Russia were consulted, sharing technical data that had been classified for decades. After 18 months of work Engine number 1 was successfully test-fired in a reinforced ground stand, its roar shaking the walls of the test cell. When the restoration was complete, the Foxbat stood on its own landing gear, for the first time since Captain Morozov pulled the ejection handle. Today, MiG-25 serial number 84M17 occupies the central exhibition hall of the Krakow Aviation Museum. Visitors walk around a machine that once represented the absolute peak of Soviet military aviation engineering. They tilt their heads back to take in the sheer scale of the massive variable geometry air intakes. They peer into the cockpit and see the handwritten Cyrillic checklist still clipped to the instrument panel combing. They learn about a captain who made a 15-minute flight across the Baltic and changed his life forever. But beyond the Cold War technology, beyond the massive engines and the stainless steel skin, there is a quieter story here. It is the story of a man who risked everything in a desperate dash across a freezing sea. A man whose aircraft ran out of fuel, but whose resolve never wavered for a single second. The Foxbat sits in silence now beneath the museum's spotlights, but its journey was anything but silent. It screamed across the sky at the edge of human engineering, then plunged into the black Baltic depths. And 24 years later, against every possible odd, it rose from the sea and rolled into the light.